Thousands lined the roads. They came on foot, on horseback, in carts, in carriages. They came from Draycott and from the villages beyond, from Chippenham and from Devizes, and from places so far removed from Wiltshire society that they had never once glimpsed the woman they now mourned. 32 of her tenants rode on horseback in black cloaks. Every soul in Draycott village appeared in mourning. The church was draped in black, and the family arms hung upon the front of the pulpit, and the September air was heavy with the scent of dying flowers and something else, something that had no name but that every woman in that crowd recognized. It was rage, quiet, feminine, permissible rage, the only kind that existed in 1825 England. Because Catherine Tylney-Long, the Wiltshire heiress, the woman who had once been the richest commoner in all of England, was dead at 35. And every person who walked behind her coffin knew exactly who had killed her. Not with a pistol, not with poison, with something far more devastating and far more legal. He had married her. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. You know what I love about these stories? They remind us that even in the darkest moments, when society turns its back, when hope seems impossible, someone can still see your worth. Someone can still fight for you. But tonight's story is different. Tonight, I need to tell you the truth, because not every story from this era ends with rescue. Not every woman was saved by a duke with a dark past and a possessive heart. Some women, extraordinary women, brave women, women who deserved better than anything the world gave them, were destroyed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. This is the true story of Catherine Tylney-Long, and it is, I believe, one of the most devastating love stories the Regency era ever produced. Not because of how she was loved, but because of how spectacularly she was betrayed. Before we begin, tell me where you're joining from tonight. This one is going to stay with you. I want to know who is here for it. Drop your city, your time, your mood. I read every single comment, and for this story especially, I want to feel your presence beside me. Now. Let me take you back to the year 1805, to a girl of 16 who had just inherited a fortune so vast it would change the course of her life and end it. Catherine Tylney-Long was born on the 2nd of October, 1789. The same year the Bastille fell in Paris, though such world-shaking events had little bearing on the nursery at Draycott House in Wiltshire, where the infant daughter of Sir James Tylney-Long, 7th Baronet, came squalling into a world that would one day worship her fortune and destroy her spirit. She was, by all accounts, a lovely child, small in stature, lively in temperament, with dark eyes that observed far more than they revealed. Her mother, Lady Catherine Windsor, was the daughter of the 4th Earl of Plymouth, which meant that the girl was well born on both sides, connected by blood to some of the oldest families in England. She had an older sister, Dorothy, and then a younger brother named James, upon whom the family's future rested, as was the custom of the age. The Tylney-Long household was, by the standards of the era, a warm one. Catherine grew up between Draycott House in Wiltshire and Wanstead House in Essex, two homes so different in character that they might have belonged to different families. Draycott was old, comfortable, rooted in the Wiltshire countryside like the oaks that lined its drive. Wanstead was something else entirely, a statement, a monument, a house that existed not merely to shelter a family, but to announce its importance to the world. Catherine moved between these two worlds with the ease of a girl who did not yet understand that she was being shaped by them, that the modesty of Draycott was teaching her humility while the grandeur of Wanstead was preparing her for a stage she had never asked to stand upon. She was educated as girls of her class were educated, in French, in music, in needlework, in the gentle arts that were considered appropriate for a baronet's daughter. But those who knew her noticed something more. a quickness of mind, a generosity of spirit that went beyond politeness into something genuine and instinctive. She noticed people, servants, tenants, the elderly woman who sold flowers at the gate. She remembered their names. She asked after their children. This quality, which seems unremarkable in our age, was extraordinary in hers. Women of Catherine's station were not required to see the people who served them. Catherine saw them anyway. But fate, as it so often did in this era, intervened with terrible precision. Sir James Tylney-Long died when Catherine was still young, leaving his wife to raise the children alone, and leaving the family in the care of a title that could only pass through the male line. Everything depended on young James. The boy was the vessel of the family's continuity, the guarantee that the Tylney-Long name and the Tylney-Long fortune would endure for another generation. Catherine loved her brother. We know this from the tenderness with which she later spoke of him, from the way she preserved his memory in a world that measured value in male heirs and saw his death primarily as a logistical problem. And then, in 1805, James died. He was not yet 11 years old. The cause is lost to history. As so many childhood deaths of this era are lost, swallowed by the brutal normalcy of infant and child mortality in a world without antibiotics, without vaccination beyond smallpox, without any of the medical interventions that we take for granted. Fever, perhaps, an infection, a sudden decline and then silence, and Catherine's world changed forever. Now, it is important to understand what this meant. In Regency England, the laws of inheritance operated with a cruelty that was considered perfectly natural. Property, wealth, and estates typically passed through the male line. A daughter was not an heir. She was an ornament, a bargaining chip, a means of alliance. But Sir James Tylney-Long's will had been drawn with unusual care. Perhaps because he had a daughter he loved, perhaps because he sensed that his son was fragile, perhaps because he understood, in a way that few men of his era did, that a woman could be trusted with wealth as well as any man. When young James died, every acre, every investment, every stone of every house devolved not to a distant male cousin, as would have happened in most families, but to his eldest daughter, Catherine. At 16 years old, she inherited estates in Essex, Hampshire, and Wiltshire, 3 counties, hundreds of tenant farms, thousands of acres of English countryside. She inherited Wanstead House, a Palladian mansion of such staggering grandeur that it rivaled Blenheim Palace, with its 6 Corinthian columns and its gardens designed to echo Versailles. Now, I want you to understand what Wanstead House was, because understanding what was lost is essential to understanding the crime. Wanstead House was not merely large, it was revolutionary. Commissioned in 1715 by Sir Richard Child, later Viscount Castlemaine, and designed by the Scottish architect Colin Campbell, it was one of the earliest examples of the Neo-Palladian style in England, a grand architectural statement that would influence country house design for a century. The facade stretched 260 feet in length, fronted by a portico of 6 Corinthian columns, the earliest of their kind in the country. The interiors had been designed and furnished by William Kent, one of the most celebrated designers of the Georgian age. The gardens were the work of George London, the foremost landscape designer of his era, later refined by Humphrey Repton. Every element, every column, every cornice, every carefully placed tree was the product of vision, skill, and generational stewardship. The house had hosted royalty. It had been photographed in sketches and paintings that circulated through the drawing rooms of Europe. It was, in the estimation of its contemporaries, one of the noblest houses not only in England, but on the entire continent. And it was Catherine's. She also inherited financial investments worth £300,000, a sum equivalent to roughly £30 million today. and she inherited an annual income of £40,000 a year. To place that in perspective, Mr. Darcy's £10,000 a year, the figure that sends the Bennet family into raptures in pride and prejudice, was considered astonishing wealth. Catherine's income was 4 times that. She was quite simply the richest commoner in England, and she was 16. They called her the Wiltshire Heiress. The name followed her like a shadow. Not Catherine, not Miss Tylney-Long, but the Wiltshire Heiress, as though her identity had been consumed by her fortune. The newspapers printed her name alongside estimates of her wealth. Satirical cartoons depicted her as a prize to be won. And the suitors, oh, the suitors came. They arrived in droves, they wrote letters, they loitered at events she attended, they engineered introductions and manufactured coincidences and declared their undying devotion with a fervour that had nothing whatsoever to do with the dark-eyed girl from Wiltshire and everything to do with the 40,000 a year. Among the most persistent was the Duke of Clarence, the future King William IV of England. He was 50 years old. She was a teenager. His motivation was no secret. He was drowning in debt, and Catherine's fortune would have been a very comfortable life raft. Catherine, to her eternal credit, refused him. She was not fooled by his rank. She recognized what he wanted, and it was not her. For 5 years, she held them all at bay. 5 years of deflecting fortune hunters, of smiling through flattery that was aimed at her bank accounts, of learning to read the difference between a man who saw her and a man who saw sterling silver. It was an education in human nature more thorough than any governess could have provided, and it made her careful. It made her wise, but not, in the end, wise enough. Because in the summer of 1810 she met William Wellesley Pole. He was, to look at him, everything a woman could want. Tall, handsome, charming, with the easy confidence of a man who had been told since birth that the world was his to enjoy. He danced well. He spoke well. He moved through a ballroom like a man who owned it, which was ironic, because he owned nothing. His pockets were empty. His debts, even at 22, were already significant. He lived entirely on the credit that his family name provided, borrowing against a future that consisted of nothing but the expectation that someone, a wealthy relative, a fortunate marriage, would eventually pay his bills. Those who knew him well, and there were those who tried to warn Catherine, understood exactly what he was. A charmer, a spender, a man whose appetites exceeded his means by a factor so vast that mathematics could not contain it. His own family knew. The Wellesley clan, for all their collective brilliance, a governor-general, a field-marshal, a political dynasty that had shaped the British Empire, had produced in William a specimen of such spectacular uselessness that even their formidable resources of influence and connection could not disguise it. But William was not stupid. He understood one thing with absolute clarity. His family name was currency, and Catherine Tylney-Long was the richest woman in England. But before I introduce him properly, because he does not deserve to arrive in this story without context, let me tell you about the world Catherine inhabited during those 5 years of siege. The London season ran from roughly April to July, coinciding with the sitting of Parliament. During these months, the great families of England descended upon the capital, renting townhouses at enormous expense, filling their days with an exhausting carousel of balls, dinners, card parties, musicales, and promenades. The purpose of all this gaiety was simple and brutal. It was a marriage market. Families invested thousands of pounds in gowns and carriages and hostesses, all for the chance to parade their daughters before eligible men. A young woman was generally given 3 seasons to secure a match. After that, whispers began. After 5, she was openly pitied. After 7, she was furniture. Catherine, with her 40,000 a year, was not pitied. She was hunted. The pursuit was so relentless, so public, so absurd that it became fodder for the satirists. caricatures appeared in print shop windows, showing Catherine besieged by suitors. Men on horseback, circling her carriage like guards around treasure, men climbing over one another to reach her, men declaring love with one hand and reaching for her purse with the other. One popular satire borrowed lines from Goldsmith. Man wants but little here below, but wants that little long. The pun was not subtle. Nothing about the pursuit of the Wiltshire heiress was subtle. Among the most persistent and most ridiculous of her suitors was Robert Coates, known to all of London as Romeo. Coates, a man widely considered the vainest in England. He was an amateur actor of staggering incompetence who wore diamonds to breakfast and whose idea of courtship involved performing Shakespeare beneath Catherine's window, apparently without irony. Catherine was not charmed. Then there was the Duke of Clarence. His Royal Highness was 50 years old, enormously in debt, and father to 10 illegitimate children by his long-time mistress. His interest in Catherine was nakedly financial. He needed her money to pay off debts that would have made most men weep. Catherine refused him with a politeness that the Duke found baffling and that posterity finds admirable. She later told friends that she had been afraid he was only after her fortune, a fear that, given his circumstances, was less a fear than a certainty. And through it all, Catherine managed something remarkable. She remained kind. She remained generous. She remained herself, a woman of intelligence and warmth and quiet wit, who happened to be carrying the weight of the largest female fortune in England on shoulders that were, by all accounts, remarkably small. Contemporary descriptions call her a pocket Venus, tiny in stature, dark-eyed, pretty in the way that quiet women are often pretty, without the flashiness that society associated with great beauty, but with something more enduring, a gentleness, a steadiness, a quality that made people want to protect her. No one protected her enough, and that is the tragedy that underlies everything that follows. Not that Catherine lacked protectors. She had a loving mother, concerned friends, and eventually a brother-in-law who would call her husband a monster. But that the protections available to women in Regency England were tissue-thin. A woman could be warned, she could be advised, she could be surrounded by people who saw the danger clearly and spoke of it openly. But she could not be saved from a bad marriage, because a bad marriage was not, in the eyes of the law, a problem that required solving. It was simply a woman's lot. William Wellesley Pole entered her life in the summer of 1810, and the courtship that followed lasted nearly 18 months. Long enough to wear down the defences of a woman who had spent 5 years building them. He was 22 years old, handsome in the way that dangerous men so often are, with charm enough to fill a ballroom, and a smile that promised everything while guaranteeing nothing. He was the son of William Wellesley Pole, 3rd Earl of Mornington, which made him nephew to 2 of the most powerful men in the British Empire, the Marquis Wellesley, who had been Governor-General of India, and Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who was at that very moment winning the wars that would define a generation. The family connections were dazzling. The man himself was penniless. This is the part where I need to pause and tell you something about how the world worked in 1810, because without understanding it, you cannot understand what happened to Catherine. In this era, a woman's wealth became her husband's upon marriage. This was not a custom. It was the law. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal person. Her property, her earnings, her inheritance, all of it transferred to her husband the moment she spoke her vows. She could not sign contracts. She could not appear in court. She could not own so much as the dress on her back without her husband's permission. The very term coverture comes from the Latin, meaning covered, because the wife's legal identity was covered, absorbed erased by her husbands. When Catherine Tylney-Long considered marriage, she was not merely choosing a companion. She was choosing the man who would control every penny of her vast fortune, every acre of her land, every room of her ancestral home. She was choosing the man who would, in the eyes of the law, own her. And she chose William. Why? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. Perhaps she was tired. 5 years of fending off fortune hunters is exhausting work. Perhaps he was simply that charming. But I think it was something else. I think William Wellesley Pole did something that none of the other suitors had ever bothered to do. He saw her. Not the fortune. Not the 40,000 a year. Not the Wiltshire heiress. Her Catherine. The small dark-eyed woman who liked books and was kind to servants, and who had spent 5 years learning to flinch every time a man smiled at her, because every smile was aimed at her bank accounts. There is a story, and whether it is precisely true or embroidered by time does not matter, because it captures something essential about why she fell, of an evening at a dinner party where Catherine was seated beside. William and he did not mention her fortune once, not once. In an era where every conversation with every suitor eventually circled back to her wealth like a dog returning to a bone, this man sat beside her and asked about her garden. He asked what she was reading. He listened when she answered, not with the glazed patience of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with what appeared to be genuine interest. "You have read Cowper," he said, when she mentioned the poet. "3 times through," she replied, "though I suspect he would find that excessive." Cowper would find breathing excessive. That was rather his difficulty. And he smiled, not at her fortune, not at her estates, but at her as though she had said something that delighted him. It is a small thing, a nothing, a scrap of conversation that would barely fill a calling card. But for a woman who had spent 5 years being appraised like livestock at a county fair, being looked at as a person, being made to laugh, it must have felt like stepping out of a cold room into sunlight. He was certainly handsome, and he pursued her with a tenacity that would have flattered anyone. He proposed 7 times. 7 times she said no, and each time he accepted the refusal with grace. He did not sulk, did not threaten, did not withdraw his attentions. He simply returned. He appeared at the same events. He engineered the same coincidental encounters. He was persistent without being aggressive, which is a trick that only the very charming or the very calculating can manage, and William was both. And then, on the 8th attempt, or perhaps it was the 7th, depending on which account you read, she said yes. There is one story, likely apocryphal, but too perfect to ignore, that says she finally relented after learning that he had fought a duel in her name, as though putting his life at risk for her honor was proof of something deeper than calculation. If true, it was a tragically romantic reason for a tragically mistaken decision. I want to be fair to Catherine here, because it would be easy, too easy, to look back from the distance of 200 years and say she should have known, she should have seen through him. She should have trusted the instincts that had protected her for 5 years and refused him an 8th time. But that is the cruelty of hindsight. The truth is, William Wellesley Pole was good at this. He was not a clumsy fortune hunter with obvious tells. He was a man who understood instinctively what a lonely woman needed to hear. And he said it. Whether any part of his affection was genuine, whether somewhere beneath the calculation there existed a flicker of real feeling for the dark-eyed girl who liked Cowper and was kind to servants, we will never know. What we know is that it worked. Catherine, who had resisted a prince and a parade of lesser men, surrendered to a man who made her feel seen. Catherine's family was not fooled. Her mother, Lady Catherine, had deep reservations. The marriage negotiations were hostile and protracted. Hundreds of legal documents, rolls of parchment so numerous they could have filled a cart, all designed to create a marriage settlement that would protect at least some of Catherine's fortune from her future husband's reach. An annual sum of £11,000 was settled for her personal use, with an additional £6,000 in case of separation. A clause that tells you everything about what her family expected. But William was not idle during these negotiations. 2 months before the wedding, before he had even married her, he went to the royal court and changed his name by royal license. He became William Pole Tylney-Long Wellesley. He took her family's name before he took her hand. And in a detail that feels almost too symbolic to be real, he placed Wellesley last, his own name, the final word, the name that would ultimately consume everything she was. They married on the 14th of March, 1812, at St. James's Church, Piccadilly. The ceremony was the social event of the season. Catherine wore white, a choice that was considered revolutionary, and which Queen Victoria would later replicate at her own wedding to great acclaim. Her necklace alone cost 25,000 guineas, a sum that would have paid the annual wages of 1,000 servants. 800 silver wedding favours were distributed among friends, those for the ladies featuring an acorn in the centre, those for the gentlemen a star, each costing a guinea and a half. Even the servants' favours were made of white satin ribbon with silver stars and silver balls. Every domestic in Catherine's household received an annuity settled for life, because Catherine Tylney-Long, even on the day that the law stripped her of her legal personhood, thought first of the people who depended on her. Her own waiting woman, the nurse who had cared for her since infancy, was singled out for particular generosity. This is the kind of woman Catherine was. This is who they destroyed. The couple departed in a magnificent chariot, painted bright yellow, emblazoned with the united arms of the Wellesley and Tylney families, drawn by 4 grey Arabian horses and attended by postilions in brown jackets with gold badges. They drove to Blackheath, to the house of William's father, and from there to Wanstead House, where their married life would begin. The newspapers reported every detail: the cost of the trousseau, the length of the wedding veil, the number of carriages in the procession, the names of the guests, the cut of the groom's coat, the quantity of champagne consumed at the wedding breakfast. England watched and envied and assumed that the Wiltshire heiress had found her happy ending. But there were omens, if you knew where to look. William forgot the wedding ring. A small detail, almost comic, the kind of thing that happens at weddings and is laughed about for years afterwards. But hindsight transforms it into something darker. The man who would systematically forget his vows, his debts, his duties, and his decency began by forgetting the very symbol of his commitment. And then there was the name. That extraordinary, absurd, revealing name, William Pole Tylney-Long Wellesley. 4 surnames, each one a claim, on Catherine's family, on Catherine's fortune, on Catherine's identity. He had taken her name before he had taken her hand. He had consumed her identity before he had consumed her wealth. And he had placed his own name last, Wellesley, the final syllable, the last word, as though everything that came before it was merely a prelude. She had not. She had found her executioner, but not immediately. That is the cruelty of it, the way it began slowly, the way the early months contained enough happiness, or at least enough normalcy, to make Catherine believe she had chosen well. There was a honeymoon period, a few weeks or months where William played the part of devoted husband with the same conviction he had brought to the role of devoted suitor. He was attentive. He was charming. He made her laugh, perhaps, in the corridors of Wanstead House, in the gardens she had walked since childhood. He was good at the performance of love, even if the substance eluded him entirely. And Catherine, who had spent 5 years developing defences against fortune hunters who had refused a prince of the blood and a host of lesser men who had learned to read the calculation behind every smile, let her guard down, because she wanted to believe, because she was human, because the alternative, acknowledging that she had made the worst mistake of her life on the happiest day of it, was too terrible to contemplate. The first signs were small: a tradesman's bill that seemed excessive, a dinner party that grew larger and more expensive than planned, a comment, perhaps overheard, about improvements to a house that needed no improving. Small things, the kind of things a new wife notices and then explains away because the alternative is unthinkable. And then, in January of 1813, less than a year after the wedding, their first child was born. A boy, William. I need you to hold this moment because it is the last unambiguously good thing that happened to Catherine Tylney-Long. A son, an heir, a small, warm, squalling creature placed in her arms in a bedchamber at Wanstead house, while the winter light came pale through the tall windows and the fire crackled and the midwife smiled, and for one brief, shining instant, everything was exactly as it should have been. Catherine loved her children. This is the one thing that every source agrees upon, the one constant in a life that was systematically stripped of every other constant. She loved them with a ferocity that surprised even the people who knew her best. This quiet, gentle woman who had never raised her voice in a ballroom suddenly had claws, suddenly had teeth, suddenly had a reason to fight that transcended fortune and reputation and everything else the world could take from her. And William. Here is the cruel part, the part that makes it all so much worse. William was pleased. He held the boy. He showed him to visitors. He played for a few weeks, or months, the role of proud father with the same facility he brought to every other role he adopted. There may even have been a moment, a single flickering moment, when Catherine looked at her husband holding their son and believed that this child would change him, that fatherhood would anchor him, that the reckless boy she had married would become the steady man her son deserved. If she believed that, she was wrong. But you cannot blame her for hoping. Hope is not stupidity. Hope is what keeps people alive when everything else has failed. And Catherine had not yet learned that hope, in the hands of a man like William, was just another thing to be squandered. The destruction, when it came, was not sudden. It was slow, creeping, the way damp spreads through a wall. Invisible at first, then a stain, then a crack, then a collapse you should have seen coming, but somehow did not. William Wellesley Pole, I will not call him by her family's name, he does not deserve it, had married Catherine for one reason, and it was not love. It was £40,000 a year, and the moment her fortune was legally his to control, he began to spend it with a recklessness that bordered on mania. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Surely she saw the signs. Surely there were warning moments before the wedding that should have told her what he was? Perhaps there were. But consider the world Catherine inhabited. Women of her station were raised to believe that a husband's management of finances was his divine right. She was not expected to question it. She was not expected to scrutinize ledgers or demand accountings. She was expected to trust and to obey and to be grateful that a man of such distinguished family had chosen her. The entire architecture of Regency society was designed to make women like Catherine powerless, and then to blame them when that powerlessness was exploited. William threw parties at Wanstead House that were the talk of London. In 1814, he hosted a grand fête to celebrate his uncle Wellington's victory over Napoleon. The Prince Regent himself attended. Thousands of guests walked the grounds, drank the champagne, admired the gardens that had been designed to rival Versailles. Orchestras played. Fireworks lit the Essex sky. The cost was astronomical, a sum that could have funded a small army, spent in a single night of celebration. And Catherine was not invited to her own party. This is not metaphor. This is documented fact. William held lavish entertainments at Wanstead House, her ancestral home, bought with her family's money, furnished with her inheritance, and excluded his wife from the guest lists. Imagine the scene. The house alive with preparation. Footmen polishing silver, maids laying out linen, the kitchen in a frenzy of roasting and baking. And Catherine, descending the staircase in a gown she had chosen for the occasion, finding her way blocked by a servant whose eyes would not meet hers. "I beg your pardon, ma'am." The words barely audible. "Mr. Wellesley Pole has asked that you remain in the East Wing this evening." "I see." 2 words. What else was there to say? What phrase existed in the English language for the moment when a woman is told she is not welcome in her own home? "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. That will be all." She turned. She climbed the stairs. She went back to the East Wing, to the rooms that had been her mother's, that still smelled faintly of lavender water and old roses. And she sat. She sat while the carriages arrived. She sat while the Prince Regent himself walked through the doors of her house. She sat while the music played and the champagne flowed, and her husband, wearing a coat paid for, with her money, charmed a roomful of people who had forgotten she existed. She was the woman who owned the walls, the chandeliers, the silver, the china, the very ground upon which the guests stood. And she was shut out. Imagine it. Imagine hearing the music from the rooms you grew up in. Imagine smelling the food that your servants who had been given annuities by you out of your money on your wedding day, were carrying to tables set with your china. Imagine seeing the carriages arriving, the guests in their silks and their jewels, walking through doors that you had walked through as a child, laughing in gardens where you had played, and knowing that you, the woman who paid for all of it, were not welcome. This is the cruelty that history has struggled to name. It was not violence. There were no bruises, no broken bones, no marks that a magistrate could examine. It was something subtler, and in its way more devastating. It was erasure. William did not merely spend Catherine's money. He spent it in ways designed to remind her that the money was no longer hers, that nothing was hers, that she existed only at his pleasure, in his shadow, and only for as long as he found her useful. And then he stopped finding her useful altogether. He gambled, recklessly, compulsively, with the confidence of a man spending someone else's fortune. He launched political campaigns. Expensive, failed political campaigns, first for the borough of St. Ives and then for Wiltshire itself, where Catherine's family name still carried weight. He won seats he never deserved, purchased with influence he had married, rather than earned, and he used those positions not for any public good, but as shields against his creditors. As a sitting member of Parliament, he enjoyed certain protections from arrest, protections that he exploited shamelessly, turning the institutions of English democracy into a personal refuge from the consequences of his own depravity. He took mistresses, openly, without shame, without even the basic courtesy of discretion that Regency society considered the minimum standard of aristocratic infidelity. In polite society, affairs were expected, but they were conducted behind closed doors. The gentleman maintained appearances, the wife pretended not to notice, and everyone moved on. William did not bother with this charade. His affairs were not whispered about behind fans. They were discussed in drawing rooms, reported in gossip sheets, caricatured in print shop windows, and endured by Catherine in a silence that must have been deafening. And this This is the detail that I find most devastating of all, and I need you to stay with me for it. Imagine Catherine at night, in Wanstead House, the house she had inherited, the house where she had been a girl. Imagine her in a bedchamber designed by William Kent, beneath a canopy of silk, staring at a ceiling painted with classical scenes that her ancestors had commissioned, listening to the sounds of a party she had paid for and been excluded from. Imagine the distant sound of laughter, his laughter, carrying through corridors that smelled of beeswax and roses. Imagine knowing that somewhere in those rooms, perhaps in the very room where her mother's portrait hung, the man who had vowed to honor her was charming another woman with the same smile he had once turned on her. And then imagine doing this night after night, month after month, year after year, while bearing his children, while managing a household, while watching the numbers in the ledger grow smaller, and the debts grow larger, and the future she had imagined. A future of security, of children raised in comfort, of growing old in the house where she had grown up, recede like a coastline seen from a departing ship. I want to stop here for a moment and acknowledge something. Some of you listening might wonder, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she fight back sooner? Why did she endure this for years without acting? And the answer is, because the world was designed to ensure that she couldn't. A wife who left her husband in 1815 or 1820 would have lost everything. Not just her social standing, though that would have been destroyed. She would have lost her children. Under the law, children belonged to their father. If Catherine had walked out of Wanstead House, William could have kept the children and barred her from ever seeing them again. And he would have. We know he would have, because that is exactly what he tried to do when she finally did leave. She stayed because she was a mother. She stayed because the price of freedom was her children. And she stayed because every institution in English society, the law, the church, the social code, the economic system, was built to keep women like her exactly where they were, silent, obedient, and slowly disappearing. And through it all, the money bled. Let me give you the scale of it, because numbers alone do not convey the obscenity of what William did. He ordered the refurbishment of Wanstead House, the house that was already one of the finest in England, that needed no improvement, that was a masterpiece of Georgian architecture that Cole and Campbell had designed to rival the great houses of Europe. The newspapers reported that the couple were fitting up Wanstead in a style of magnificence exceeding even Carlton House. Carlton House being the Prince Regent's own London residence, the gold standard of aristocratic excess. The estimated cost was staggering for renovations to a house that was already perfect. Accumulated debts with tradesmen across London, tailors, wine merchants, jewellers, upholsterers, all extended credit to the man who had married the richest woman in England, assuming that such a fortune was bottomless. It was not. No fortune is. But William behaved as though the well would never run dry, ordering and purchasing and commissioning with the frantic energy of a man who suspected, somewhere beneath his bravado, that this could not last. He borrowed. Against the marriage settlement, against Catherine's estates, against future income that had not yet been earned. He created a labyrinth of debt so complex that his own father, the 3rd Earl of Mornington, a man experienced in politics and finance, could barely comprehend its scope. When his father tried to intervene, to impose some discipline, William ignored him. When creditors came calling, William obtained a court appointment that rendered him immune to arrest for debt, using the connections of the Wellesley family, the family he had married into and was busily destroying. And through all of this, 2 more children arrived, James, born in 1815, Victoria, born in 1819. 2 more reasons for Catherine to stay, 2 more hostages to the marriage she could not escape. 3 children in total, born into a household where the walls shook with extravagance and the foundations crumbled with debt. 3 children whose mother loved them with a ferocity that would, in the end, become the one force that William could not overcome. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before the end, there was the most humiliating chapter of all: the flight from England. By the early 1820s, William's debts had become so enormous that remaining in England was no longer safe. Creditors were circling, lawsuits were multiplying. The Wiltshire heiress, the woman who had once hosted princes and refused kings, was now a fugitive from debt collectors. The family fled to the continent, settling first in Paris, and then travelling through Italy, sustained by Catherine's remaining personal income of £11,000 a year, the amount the marriage settlement had reserved for her separate use, the one provision that William's lawyers had been unable to touch. Think about that for a moment. An income of £11,000 a year, which would have been considered luxurious wealth for any ordinary family, was now all that stood between Catherine and complete destitution. Her husband had burned through £40,000 a year and left nothing but ashes. In Paris, William lived exactly as he had lived in England, moving in fashionable circles, spending money he did not have, maintaining the illusion of grandeur while his wife counted shillings. His father, Lord Maryborough, tried desperately to salvage the situation. He placed the remaining finances in the hands of trustees. He wrote to William with stark warnings: "If you persevere for only 3 years, you may return here in affluence and credit far beyond anything we thought possible." He begged his son to exercise restraint, to let the trustees do their work, to simply stop spending for 3 years. William lasted less than 1. Within a decade, 10 short years, William Wellesley Pole had burned through a fortune that should have sustained a dynasty for generations. His debts exceeded £250,000. When confronted, he blamed his servants. He said he had been robbed. He said the expenditures at Wanstead had been someone else's fault. He took responsibility for nothing because that is what men like him do. They consume and they blame and they consume again. Now, I have to pause here because this is where the story becomes almost unbearable. And I want you to sit with what I'm about to tell you, because it is the detail that, for me, transforms this from a tale of financial ruin into something far darker. Wanstead House, that Palladian masterpiece, that rival to Blenheim, that crown jewel of English architecture, had to be sold. But it could not simply be sold, because under the terms of Sir James Tylney-Long's will, Wanstead House was inalienable from the park. The house and the grounds could not be separated, and the land could not be sold for 1,000 years. The will had been designed to protect the family's legacy. It had not anticipated a son-in-law whose sole talent was destruction. So the trustees, operating under powers contained within the marriage settlement, did the only thing they could. In June of 1822, they put the contents of Wanstead House up for auction. It lasted 32 days. I want you to imagine this. Imagine strangers walking through your home. Not a house you rented, not a house you merely lived in, but the home your family built. The home where your father and your grandfather and your great-grandfather lived and died. The home where you were a girl, where you ran through corridors and hid behind curtains and pressed your face against cold window panes, watching the rain fall on gardens that had been designed to rival Versailles. Now imagine watching as those strangers pick through your possessions, one by one. The mahogany desk where your father wrote his letters. The portrait of your mother that hung above the fireplace in the morning room. The blue and white china that had been in the family for 3 generations. The books, shelves upon shelves of books that had been collected over a century, each one with a story, each one with a particular scent of leather and dust and time. Imagine watching as an auctioneer, a professional, a man named George Robbins, who was very good at his job, described these pieces in a catalogue designed not to honour their history but to sell them. Robbins's catalogue was a masterwork of marketing. He did not list items. He sold a lifestyle. He described the rooms as they had been lived in, the carpets still on the floors, the curtains still drawn, the beds still made, as though inviting buyers not merely to purchase objects, but to step into the ghost of a life that had been lived there. The Boulay furniture went first, extraordinary pieces of French craftsmanship that had been collected during the fashionable craze for Ancien Régime furnishings, the kind of furniture that had once graced the palaces of Versailles. Axminster carpets, state bedsteads with canopies of silk, plate glass mirrors that had reflected the faces of princes, silver that had been polished by servants Catherine had treated with kindness, crystal that had held champagne at parties she had paid for and been excluded from. The wines went too. The cellars were extensive, and the bottles were old, and they were auctioned lot by lot to men who would drink them without ever knowing that they had been purchased with the fortune of a woman who was at that very moment in exile on the continent with 3 children and a stomach complaint that would not ease, and a husband who was conducting his affair with the wife of a Coldstream Guards captain in full view of European society. 32 days. That is how long it takes to sell a century of collecting. That is how long it takes to erase a family's legacy. 32 days, and then the rooms were empty, and the doors were closed, and the greatest Palladian mansion in Essex stood silent and hollow, a shell of what it had been, waiting for the final indignity. Some pieces were bought by the Earl of Pembroke to furnish Wilton House, others scattered across England into drawing rooms and country houses where no one would ever know they had once belonged to the Wiltshire heiress. Even her family portraits were lost, the faces of her ancestors sold to strangers who would never know their names. William later kept some of Catherine's remaining heirlooms, but even those had to be auctioned off in 1852 because he never paid the storage fees. Their whereabouts today are unknown. 200 years later, pieces of Catherine's home are scattered across England in anonymous collections, and no one can find them. Can I just say, this is the part of the story that keeps me up at night. Not the grand betrayals, not the affair, or the custody battle, or the death, but this, the selling of her things, the dismemberment of her world, object by object, lot by lot, over 32 days, while she was powerless to stop it. There is something about the loss of physical objects, the things you touched, the things that held your memories, that cuts deeper than any financial abstraction. £40,000 a year is a number. A mother's portrait is a piece of your soul. And when the contents were gone, when there was nothing left inside Wanstead House but echoes and dust and the ghost of a fortune that had vanished, no buyer could be found for the building itself. So in 1825, the greatest Palladian mansion in Essex, the house that had cost £360,000 to build, was demolished and sold for scrap. It brought £10,000. £10,000 for a house that had rivaled palaces, for the place where Catherine had been a girl, where she had walked the gardens and read books in the library and believed that her wealth would keep her safe, reduced to timber and stone and carted away. But the destruction of her fortune and her home was not the worst of it. The worst, the detail that Catherine confided to her sisters in letters she never intended for public eyes, was what he did to her body. Catherine implied, in correspondence that survived her, that William had given her a venereal disease. I will let that settle. The man she had married, the man she had chosen over a future king, had brought disease into her marriage bed. And in Regency England, this was not simply a medical crisis. It was a sentence. Now, I want to speak about this carefully, because Catherine's suffering deserves honesty, not euphemism. In the early 19th century, there were no antibiotics. There was no penicillin, no understanding of bacteriology, no treatment that could reliably cure the diseases that William carried to his wife from the beds of his mistresses. What existed were mercury treatments, toxic, agonizing, and often more damaging than the diseases they were meant to cure. Mercury was administered orally, rubbed into the skin as an ointment, or inhaled as a vapor. The side effects included tooth loss, ulceration of the mouth and throat, tremors, kidney damage, and a slow, systemic poisoning that could take years to kill. The cure, in many cases, was worse than the disease, and the disease itself was terrible enough. What existed besides? Mercury were poultices and rest and laudanum for the pain and the quiet, devastating knowledge that your body had been poisoned by the man who had vowed to honor it. The stomach complaints that would plague Catherine for the rest of her shortened life. The complaints that would worsen during the continental exile, and that would ultimately contribute to her death at 35. Almost certainly stemmed from this poisoning. Whether the disease itself or the toxic treatments she received to combat it did the greater damage, we will never know. What we know is that Catherine's body was being destroyed from within, and that the man responsible was spending her money to entertain the women who had given him the disease in the first place. This is the part of the story where the word betrayal loses its adequacy. Betrayal is too small a word, too polite, too abstract. What William did to Catherine was not merely betrayal. It was a physical invasion, a contamination of the most intimate sanctuary a person has, a poisoning of her very blood by the man who was supposed to protect her. And divorce was not an option, not a real one. In Regency England, divorce required an Act of Parliament. It cost thousands of pounds. It required proving adultery, which meant public testimony, courtroom humiliation, the intimate details of a marriage laid bare for the entertainment of lawyers and journalists, and anyone who could purchase a gallery seat. Even when divorce was granted, the woman's reputation was destroyed far more thoroughly than the man's. A divorced woman was a fallen woman, regardless of who had caused the fall. Catherine endured. She endured because she had no choice, and because she had 3 children, and because the world she lived in was designed to ensure that women like her had no exit. But the destruction of her fortune and her home and her health were not the end of it. There was still the exile, and the exile was in some ways the cruelest chapter of all, because it stripped away the last thing Catherine had left, her dignity. By the early 1820s, the debts had become unmanageable. William obtained a nominal court appointment, gentleman usher to George IV, which rendered him immune to arrest for debt. It was a legal trick, a manipulation of the system, the kind of maneuver that only a man with powerful connections could pull off. And then, armed with this protection, he made the decision that no amount of legal immunity could disguise. They would leave England. The family fled to the continent around 1823. Think about what this meant for Catherine. She was the Wiltshire heiress, the woman whose family had held lands in 3 English counties, whose home had rivaled palaces, whose name had been synonymous with English wealth and English respectability. And now she was a fugitive, running from creditors, leaving behind the country that had been her birthright, the society that had been her world, the land where her parents were buried and her children should have been raised. They settled first in Paris, where William lived exactly as he had lived in England, spending money he did not have, attending fashionable events, maintaining the facade of grandeur while his wife counted the remaining shillings of her separate allowance. His father wrote increasingly desperate letters. If you come to England before your affairs are arranged, I see no possibility of preventing your being put into jail during the whole of my life." He begged his son to be sensible. He pleaded for restraint. William ignored him. William always ignored the people who told him the truth. And then they moved to Italy. Naples, the city of heat and light and crumbling grandeur. The city where so many English aristocrats went to escape their creditors and their consciences. And it was in Naples, in the shimmering Italian summer of 1823, that William met Helena Bligh. But before I tell you about Helena, I need you to think about the children. William was 10 years old. James was 8. Victoria was 4. These were not abstractions. They were not plot devices. They were children. Real children with real eyes and real ears and the terrifying capacity that all children have to understand far more than adults believe they do. They had grown up in a household of escalating chaos. They had been born in a Palladian mansion and were now living in rented lodgings on the continent. They had watched their mother's jewels disappear, their home emptied of its treasures, their lives uprooted from the only country they had ever known. They had heard arguments. They had seen their mother's face, that particular expression that children recognize instinctively, even when no one explains it to them. The expression of a woman trying very hard to pretend that everything is fine. Children know. They always know. And Catherine's children knew that their father was not what he appeared to be. They knew it in the way that children know things, not through evidence or argument, but through the quality of silence at the dinner table, through the tension in their mother's hands when she smoothed their hair, through the sound of raised voices behind closed doors that were supposed to be thick enough to contain them, but never were. What happened next would change everything. Everything. Her name was Helena Bligh, wife of Captain Thomas Bligh of the Coldstream Guards. She was a protégée of the Duke of Wellington. Some whispered she was his natural daughter, though this was likely one of many rumours that William himself encouraged. While Catherine waited in their lodgings with 3 children and a stomach complaint that would not ease, William pursued this woman with the same relentless energy he had once directed at Catherine's fortune. He did not conduct this affair quietly. He did not maintain even the thin fiction of discretion that Regency society demanded of its adulterers. He installed Helena Bligh in his own household, openly, brazenly, in the same rooms where his wife and children lived. He paraded her through Italian society as though she were his wife and Catherine were the interloper. He turned his marriage into a public humiliation so complete that even the hardened gossips of the expatriate community winced. Catherine endured it. For months, she endured it. Because what choice did she have? She was in a foreign country. She had 3 young children. She had no independent means beyond the 11,000 a year that the marriage settlement provided. She could not simply leave. Where would she go? How would she travel? Who would help a wife fleeing her husband in a world where wives belonged to their husbands like furniture? But Catherine Tylney-Long was not furniture. She had never been furniture, no matter how hard the world tried to make her into an object. First an object of wealth, then an object of pity, now an object of betrayal. She was a woman, and she had a breaking point. In the summer of 1824, she reached it. The conversation, because there must have been one, because even the most broken marriages produce a final reckoning, would have taken place in their rented lodgings in Naples, a room that smelled of heat and jasmine and the particular staleness of a life lived in exile. The shutters drawn against the afternoon sun, the children somewhere in the house. Oh, I saw Victoria napping, perhaps, and the boys reading or quarrelling or doing whatever boys of 10 and 8 do in a foreign city while their parents' marriage collapses around them. I imagine her sitting. I imagine him standing, because William always stood when he was uncomfortable, always positioned himself higher, always used his physical presence to remind her that the world was built for men his size and not for pocket Venuses who liked Cowper. "Sit down, William. I prefer to stand. And I prefer to have a husband who does not parade his mistress through the streets of Naples. It seems we are both to be disappointed." Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room like water, rising, pressing, making it hard to breathe. And then Catherine spoke again. And when she did, her voice was different. Not louder, quieter. The voice of a woman who has passed through anger into something colder and more permanent. "Your relationship with Mrs. Bligh is an insuperable obstacle to any reconciliation between us. You understand that?" "You are being dramatic." "I am being precise. If you come to England to bother me, or the children, I will commence divorce proceedings. I will submit evidence of your adultery to the ecclesiastical courts. I will endure whatever humiliation the process requires, and I will do it publicly." A threat of divorce in 1824 from a woman. These words, spoken in a rented room in Naples, were the most radical thing Catherine Tylney-Long had ever said. Divorce would have destroyed her reputation. It would have left her children in legal limbo. It would have cost a fortune she no longer had, and she was willing to do it anyway, because anything was better than watching her husband conduct his affair in her own home. William's response was to continue seeing Helena Bligh. He did not even grant her the dignity of pretending to consider her ultimatum. He simply carried on, as he had always carried on, as he would always carry on, consuming what he wanted and discarding what he did not, leaving Catherine to pick up the pieces of a life he had smashed without a second thought. And so Catherine made the bravest decision she had made since refusing the Duke of Clarence a decade and a half earlier. In July of 1824, she took her 3 children, William, who was 11, James, who was 9, and Victoria, who was 5. And she returned to England, alone, without her husband, without his permission, without the protection of any man. Think about the logistics of this journey, because we so often tell stories of women fleeing without considering what fleeing actually entailed in an era before railways crossed the Alps, before steamships ran on reliable schedules, before a woman travelling alone with 3 children could do so without drawing the attention of every innkeeper and customs official between Naples and the English Channel. She would have travelled by carriage through the Italian countryside in the heat of July, the leather seats burning through her dress, the dust rising in clouds that coated the children's hair and settled in the creases of their clothes, the road jolting and pitching beneath them with every rut and stone. Victoria, 5 years old and too young to understand why they were leaving, would have slept against her mother's shoulder, her small body heavy and damp with sweat, her breath warm against Catherine's neck. The boys would have sat opposite, watching the landscape change through windows smeared with dust and the fingerprints of 100 previous travellers. They would have asked questions. Where are we going? Why isn't Papa coming? When will we be back? And Catherine would have answered them with whatever version of the truth a mother gives her children when the real truth would break them. Day after day, coaching in after coaching in, rooms that smelled of old straw and tallow candles, and the cooking of strangers, meals of cold meat and hard bread and whatever the innkeeper's wife could manage for 3 English children who did not speak the language, and a mother who was too ill to eat, but who cut their food into pieces and smiled and said everything was going to be fine. Through Italy, through France, the landscape changing, the terracotta and olive groves giving way to grey stone and green fields, the heat softening into something cooler and damper, the smell of the Mediterranean replaced by the earthier scent of northern European rain. And all the while, the knowledge sitting in Catherine's chest like a stone, that every mile northward was a mile closer to England and a mile further from the man who, at any moment, might decide to follow. She would have reached the coast, Calais perhaps, or Boulogne, the harbour smell of salt and tar and fish, the packet ship waiting, a small vessel built for the crossing, not for comfort, the channel grey and heaving beneath a sky that promised nothing good. And Catherine would have gathered her children and stepped aboard and stood at the rail as the French coast shrank behind them. And she would have known, with the certainty that comes only from having lost everything else, that there was no going back. Whatever waited on the other side of that grey water, it was hers now, hers and her children's, and no one else's. She was 34 years old. She had been married for 12 years. She had lost her fortune, her home, her health, and very nearly her sanity. But she had not lost her children. Not yet. I have to stop here for a moment, because I want to make sure you understand what Catherine was facing. In 1824, a woman who left her husband, even a husband who had stolen her fortune, demolished her home, paraded his mistress before her eyes, and given her a disease, had no legal standing. She was, in the eyes of English law, a runaway. Her husband had every right to demand her return. He had every right to take her children. He had the weight of centuries of legal tradition behind him, and she had nothing but her wits and her sisters, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize that what was legal was not the same as what was just. The journey back to England must have been terrifying. Every mile of coastline, every rattle of carriage wheels, every inn where she stopped with 3 exhausted children must have carried the fear that William would follow, that he would send men to bring her back, that the law, which had done nothing to protect her for 12 years, would be used to punish her for finally running. She made it. She crossed the Channel, and she returned to England, and she gathered her children around her like a woman gathering kindling before a long, cold night. She settled with her 2 unmarried sisters, Dorothy and Emma, in a house in the Paragon, Richmond. It was a modest dwelling, by the standards of the world she had once inhabited. A world of Palladian columns and gardens that echoed Versailles. But it was quiet, and it was safe, and her children were with her, and for a few months Catherine must have believed that the worst was behind her. Those months in Richmond, I think about them often. For the first time in years, Catherine was in a home where the conversation was not about debt, where the air was not thick with the smell of another woman's perfume, where her sisters, Dorothy and Emma, those faithful unmarried women who would later carry her fight into the courts, surrounded her with the kind of love that asks nothing and gives everything. The children, too, must have felt the change. Victoria was only 5, young enough to adapt, young enough to find joy in a garden that was not Versailles, but was green and alive, and hers to play in. William and James were older, and older children carry heavier memories, but even they must have breathed more easily in a household where their mother smiled. Catherine walked in Richmond Park. She read to her children. She wrote letters to friends with a warmth that suggests she had not been entirely destroyed, that somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the illness and the accumulated grief of 13 wasted years, the girl from Draycott was still there, still kind, still generous, still capable of noticing other people's suffering even when her own was vast. There is an image I carry of Catherine during this period, not from any painting or sketch, because none survive from these final months, but from the fragments of letters and the testimony of people who knew her. I see her in the garden of the house in Richmond on a late summer afternoon, with Victoria on her lap and a book open on the bench beside her. The boys are somewhere nearby, their voices carrying across the lawn, arguing about something inconsequential, the way brothers do. The light is golden, the way English light is golden in August, and Catherine is doing nothing, just sitting, just holding her daughter, just listening to her sons be boys. "Mamma, read to me." "What shall we read?" "The one about the mouse." "Again? We've read that one 3 times, 4 times. Read it again." And Catherine would have laughed. A small laugh, tired around the edges but real. And she would have read the story about the mouse for the 5th time, and Victoria would have fallen asleep against her chest, and the sun would have moved across the garden, and for one afternoon, one single, ordinary, unremarkable afternoon, Catherine Tylney-Long was happy. I tell you this because the story demands it. Not every moment was suffering. Not every hour was grief. There were these moments, these small, precious, unbearable moments of peace, and they matter because they show you what was at stake. Not 40,000 a year, not Wanstead House, this. A woman reading to her daughter in a garden. The sound of her sons arguing in the distance. The warmth of a child's body against her own. This is what Catherine was fighting to protect. And this is what she knew she was about to lose. But her body was betraying her. The stomach complaints that had begun in Italy were worsening. She was thinner than she should have been, and tireder, and there were days when the effort of maintaining the cheerful fiction that everything was fine must have felt like lifting stones. It was not. William, predictably, was furious. Not because he had lost his wife, he had abandoned her freely and enthusiastically, but because the children represented money. Specifically, Catherine's eldest son, William, was the heir upon whom the remaining Tylney-Long fortune had devolved. If William Sr. could regain custody of his son, he could regain access to the inheritance he had not yet managed to destroy. Catherine knew this. She understood with the clarity of a woman who had been systematically exploited for 12 years that her husband's sudden interest in fatherhood had nothing to do with paternal love and everything to do with pounds and shillings. She was informed that William had declared that if he could not obtain custody of the children by legal means, he would resort to stratagem. Stratagem. That was the word he used, as though his children were a military objective, as though his family were a fortress to be taken by cunning rather than by right. The man who had never shown the slightest interest in his children's education, their health, their happiness, or their welfare was now speaking of them as though they were assets to be seized. This is the moment, and I need you to hear this, when Catherine Tylney-Long stopped being a victim and became something else entirely. Something that the law did not anticipate and the courts had never seen. She went into hiding. She moved from place to place, keeping her children close, staying one step ahead of the husband she believed capable of anything. She consulted lawyers. She wrote letters. She began proceedings to make her children wards in Chancery, placing them under the protection of the court, beyond their father's legal reach. This was an extraordinary step. In 1825, a father's right to his children was considered almost absolute. The idea that a mother could petition the court to strip a father of custody was radical. It was unprecedented. It had never been done. And Catherine pursued it with the same quiet determination that had once kept fortune hunters at bay for 5 years, the same steel that had always lived beneath her softness, waiting for the moment when gentleness was no longer enough. She was racing against time, though she did not know how little she had left. But her body, which had endured so much, the stress, the disease, the pregnancies, the grief, the years of being ground down by a man who treated her like a bank account with a heartbeat, was failing. On the 7th of September 1825, Catherine arrived at the house in Richmond with her children and her sisters. She had been unwell. The stomach complaint that had plagued her for months was worsening. That evening she was seized with violent spasms so severe that the household feared the worst. And in the grip of that pain, with death suddenly and terrifyingly possible, with the taste of copper on her tongue, and her children sleeping in rooms down the hall, and her husband somewhere in Europe with his mistress, plotting to take them, Catherine did the last brave thing she would ever do. She called her sister Dorothy into another room. She closed the door, and she spoke with the focused urgency of a woman who has just realized that she has hours, not years. "Dorothy, listen to me carefully." "You should rest, Catherine," the physician said. "The physician cannot help me. You know that. I know that. We have very little time, and I need you to listen." Dorothy listened. And what Catherine said in that closed room, what she laid out with the precision of a woman who had spent 13 years learning exactly how the law could be used against her, was not a farewell. It was a battle plan. The will she had signed in 1815, the one William had directed, the one drawn up under his influence to serve his interests rather than her children's, needed to be revoked. Right now. Tonight. Before another sunrise brought another risk. The will must be changed. William cannot be trusted with the children's inheritance. You know what he will do. You have seen what he does. Catherine, promise me. Promise me you will see this through. The chancery proceedings, the wardship. Promise me that when I am gone, you will not let him take them. I promise. Swear it. I swear it, Catherine, on my life. He will not have them. Catherine dictated the new will. She spoke clearly, precisely, naming her children as beneficiaries, establishing protections that her husband's lawyers would have to fight through layer after layer to reach. She had it witnessed, properly, formally, in accordance with every legal requirement. Because Catherine Tylney-Long, who had been told for 13 years that she had no legal standing, had learned the law better than many of the men who practiced it. And then, in the days that followed, as her condition worsened, she continued the chancery proceedings. From her bed, from the house in Richmond, with the clock running out and the pen shaking in her hand, and the knowledge that every legal document she signed was a brick in the wall that would stand between her children and their father. Her sisters were with her, Dorothy and Emma, those quiet, steadfast women who had never married, who had watched their sister's destruction from the sidelines, with the particular anguish of people who can see the disaster clearly but cannot prevent it. They were with her now, in the room, where the curtains were drawn against the September light, fetching water and adjusting pillows and doing the small, useless, necessary things that people do when someone they love is dying. The children were in the house, too. William, who was 12 now and old enough to understand that his mother was very ill, James, who was 10 and trying to be brave, and Victoria, who was 6 and wanted to know why everyone was crying. Catherine spoke to her sisters about the will. She spoke about the chancery proceedings. She spoke about which solicitor to contact and which documents still needed signatures and where the copies were kept. Even in her final days, she was organizing, planning, building the legal fortress that would protect her children after she was gone. There was no self-pity in these conversations, or if there was, the accounts that survive do not record it. What they record is purpose. A woman who knew she was dying and chose to spend her remaining hours not in lamentation, but in action. 5 days later, on Monday the 12th of September 1825, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Catherine Tylney-Long died. She was 35 years old. There are conflicting accounts of the immediate cause. Some say it was the stomach complaint that had troubled her for weeks, the same complaint that may have been connected to the disease William gave her, the disease that no medicine of the era could treat. Others note that she had recently received a letter from William, the contents of which caused her to have some form of seizure. We will never know what was in that letter, but we know the kind of man who wrote it, and we can imagine what cruelties it contained. What we do know is that Catherine died as she had lived, thinking of others. Her final arrangements were not for herself. There was no vanity in her dying, no requests for particular gowns or jewels to be buried in, no concern for how she would be remembered by society. Her final hours were spent ensuring that the legal documents were in order, that the will was signed and witnessed, that the Chancery petition would proceed even after she was gone, that Dorothy and Emma knew exactly what to do, whom to contact, which solicitors to trust, and which arguments to make. She was a general planning her last campaign, and the battlefield was not a courtroom she would ever see. It was the future, her children's future, the one thing she still had the power to shape. It is said that Catherine's dying wish was that her children should never see their father again. Let me say that once more, because it matters. Her dying wish, the last thing she wanted, the final request of a woman who had spent 13 years being robbed and humiliated and betrayed, was not for vengeance. It was not for her fortune to be restored, or her home to be rebuilt, or her name to be cleared. It was for her children to be safe. Even in death she put them first. Even at the very end, when she had nothing left to give, she gave the only thing she had: her will, her determination, her refusal to let the man who had destroyed her also destroy them. And then came the funeral. If you have been listening carefully, you will remember how this story began. With thousands lining the roads, with tenants on horseback in black cloaks, with an entire village in mourning. Let me paint this scene for you, because it matters. Because after everything that was taken from Catherine, her money, her home, her health, her name, her legal personhood, her very life, this is the moment when the world gave something back. The funeral procession began at the house in Richmond and made its way to Draycott Church in Wiltshire, a journey of many miles through the heart of the English countryside that Catherine's family had called home for generations. Within half a mile of Draycott, 32 of her tenants joined the procession on horseback, dressed in black cloaks. These were not hired mourners. These were people who remembered, people who had received annuities on Catherine's wedding day, people who had been treated with kindness by a woman who had every reason to retreat into the fortress of her own wealth and never look down, but who had chosen again and again to look down, to see the people around her, to care. Every soul in Draycott village appeared in mourning, not because they were required to, not because anyone commanded their grief, but because Catherine Tylney-Long had been their lady, and they knew what had been done to her, and they were angry. The church was draped in black. The family arms hung upon the pulpit, and outside, stretching along the roads, thousands of people stood in the September air and paid their respects to a woman who had been systematically erased by her husband for 13 years, and who, in death, was more visible, more present, more remembered than she had been at any point in her marriage. Because Catherine Tylney-Long, who had been systematically erased by her husband for 13 years, her fortune stolen, her home demolished, her health destroyed, her very identity subsumed into his ridiculous quadruple-barreled name, was not forgotten. The people of Wiltshire remembered. The tenants who had received annuities on her wedding day remembered. The servants she had treated with kindness remembered. England itself remembered. The newspapers, which had once reported her wedding with breathless excitement, now reported her death with barely concealed fury. Her obituary in the Observer spoke of a woman whose fortune had been meant to bring her happiness and splendour, and instead had brought her worse than poverty. It spoke of a life that seemed to have been sacrificed and a heart ultimately broken through the very means which should have cherished and maintained her. Her friend Sir George Dallas wrote words that survive to this day, words so beautiful and so angry that they read less like a tribute and more like an accusation hurled at heaven and earth alike. He spoke of a soul so pure, so acceptable in God's sight, that it could only have been summoned to receive a crown of righteousness, and to find shelter from the earthly storm that had wrecked her happiness and threatened her future days with increasing misery. And Bartholomew Bouverie, her brother-in-law, wrote to her sisters with a fury that crackles across 2 centuries. What remorse must that wretch feel, or rather ought to feel, when he learns about what his perfidy and cruelty have effected. Alas, I fear his heart is so hardened, and his mind so completely depraved as to be alive only to a very different impression. He added, with the kind of practical urgency that grief sometimes produces. I hope the proceedings in Chancery were so far advanced that the eldest boy is now actually a ward in Chancery, and therefore all that property will be kept completely out of that monster's reach. That monster! Catherine's own brother-in-law called William a monster. Not in a private diary, not in a whispered aside, in a letter written in the immediate aftermath of her death, with the ink still wet and the rage still fresh. Catherine was buried at Draycott Church. The procession stretched for half a mile. Within that crowd, grief sat side by side with something harder, something that had been building for 13 years and was now, finally, ready to act. Because Catherine Tylney-Long was dead, but her revenge was just beginning. Now I want you to understand something about what happened next, because it is, in many ways, the most extraordinary part of this story, and it is the part that history has failed to celebrate as it deserves. The custody battle that followed Catherine's death was not merely a family dispute. It was a legal revolution. And it was fought not by Catherine, she was gone, but by the women she had left behind and the institutions she had set in motion before she died. Her sisters, Dorothy and Emma Tylney-Long, took custody of the 3 children. They were unmarried women, which in 1825 meant they were among the very few women in England who still possessed legal personhood. A married woman could not have done what they did. A married woman did not exist in the eyes of the law, but Dorothy and Emma were spinsters, and spinsters could act. They petitioned the Court of Chancery. They argued that William Wellesley Pole was unfit to raise his own children. And they were not alone. Standing with them, lending the full weight of his name and his influence, was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the most famous man in England, the hero of Waterloo, and William's own uncle. I want you to appreciate the extraordinary nature of this alliance. The Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, the man who had defeated Napoleon, who had reshaped the map of Europe, who was considered the greatest soldier of his age, had looked at his own nephew's conduct and decided that the man was not fit to raise children. This was not a distant, formal intervention. Wellington threw himself into the custody battle with the same strategic determination he had brought to the Peninsular War. He appeared in court, he submitted testimony, he used his name and his influence and his formidable will to ensure that Catherine's children would be protected. And William fought back. Of course he did, because the children, particularly young William, the eldest, represented money. The Tylney-Long fortune that had not been entirely consumed was held in trust for the boy. If William Sr. could regain custody, he could regain access to those funds. His interest in fatherhood was, as it had always been, denominated in pounds sterling. The legal battle raged for years. William hired lawyers. He filed petitions. He submitted affidavits that painted himself as a devoted father cruelly separated from his offspring, a fiction so brazen that even the court officials must have marveled at his audacity. The Court of Chancery, true to its reputation, moved with agonizing slowness. Evidence was gathered, arguments were made, postponements were granted, and through it all, the children remained with their aunts, while the machinery of English justice ground forward at its own glacial pace. Now, let me tell you what it means when we say the Court of Chancery, because if you have read Dickens's Bleak House, you know that the Chancery Court was a byword for endless, soul-destroying litigation. Cases dragged on for decades. Fortunes were consumed by legal fees. Dickens himself was partly inspired by cases like this one, the interminable grinding of law against law, the mountain of paperwork, the armies of solicitors and barristers feeding off the carcass of human suffering. The Chancery was where hope went to die. But Catherine's case, the case she had begun on her deathbed, the case her sisters carried forward with the tenacity of women who had promised their dying sister that her children would be safe. This case moved with unusual purpose, because the Lord Chancellor, Lord Eldon, one of the most conservative jurists in English history, a man who had opposed reform at every turn, who embodied the old order in every fibre of his being, looked at the evidence of William Wellesley Pole's conduct and made a decision that shattered precedent. I want to put you in that courtroom, Lincoln's Inn, the Chancery Chambers, a room of dark wood and high ceilings and the particular hush that settles over a court when the judge is about to speak. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath, of 100 people leaning forward in their seats, of barristers frozen with their quills poised above their notebooks. The room smelled of old paper and damp wool and the acrid tang of tallow candles that had been burning since morning. Lord Eldon sat above them all. A man in his 70s, in his wig and his robes, with a face that had been shaped by decades of dispensing judgment and that betrayed nothing. He was not, by temperament or conviction, a reformer. He had opposed Catholic emancipation. He had resisted parliamentary reform. He believed in the established order with the fervent certainty of a man who had risen within it. The doctrine of paternal rights was not, to Lord Eldon, a debatable proposition. It was a pillar of English law. It was as fixed as the monarchy, as immutable as the tides. And he looked down at the evidence that had been assembled, the testimony of servants, the records of debt, the documented affairs, the letters from Catherine's family, the medical reports that hinted at unspeakable disease, the entire damning catalogue of William Wellesley Pole's 13-year campaign of destruction. And he said no. He ruled that William Wellesley Pole should be the first man in English history to be denied custody of his children on the grounds of moral conduct. The first, in all of English legal history. Let that settle over you. You could have heard the intake of breath. You could have heard the scratch of every quill in the gallery as the journalists wrote it down. You could have seen the faces of William's lawyers that he had babarand watin saigas find precise moment when professional composure gave way to the understanding that their client had just lost, that the most fundamental right a father possessed in England had just been taken from him, and that no amount of appeals or petitions or parliamentary manoeuvring would give it back. And somewhere, not in the courtroom, because they were women, and women did not sit in the public galleries of the Chancery Court, Dorothy and Emma Tylney-Long received the news, and they wept, not with grief, with something else entirely. No father had ever been stripped of his paternal rights because of how he had behaved. Fathers had beaten their children, abandoned their children, starved their children, sold their daughters into marriages that were little better than servitude. And the law had looked the other way, because the law said that children belonged to their father. Full stop. Until Catherine. Until the case that Catherine had set in motion. Until a Lord Chancellor, a Conservative Lord Chancellor, a man who had never in his career championed the rights of women or children, decided that William Wellesley Pole's conduct was so egregious, so comprehensively vile that even the ancient, unshakable doctrine of paternal authority had to yield. William was enraged. He fought the ruling with every weapon at his disposal. He tried to regain custody of his eldest son. Not because he loved the boy, but because the boy's inheritance was the last fortune he had not yet managed to destroy. He was committed to the Fleet prison in July of 1831 for contempt of court, for defying the Chancery's orders, for attempting to circumvent the ruling through schemes and stratagems that the court could no longer tolerate. The Fleet prison. I want you to picture this because the irony is almost too precise to be accidental. The Fleet was London's debtors' prison, a medieval fortress near Ludgate Hill where men who could not or would not pay their debts were confined behind walls that smelled of damp stone and human despair. It was the place where the consequences of financial recklessness came home to roost. The place where men who had lived beyond their means discovered what it felt like to live within very narrow means indeed. Within walls, within cells, within the crushing reality that charm and connections had finally, irrevocably failed them. William Wellesley Pole, the man who had burned through £40,000 a year, who had demolished Wanstead House, who had hosted princes and refused to invite his own wife, was now a prisoner. The nephew of the Duke of Wellington, the son of an earl, the man who had changed his name to swallow an entire dynasty, was sleeping behind bars because he could not stop trying to steal what the courts had placed beyond his reach. He tried to claim parliamentary privilege, arguing that as a member of Parliament he could not be imprisoned. The Committee of Privileges rejected his plea. Even Parliament, that bastion of male prerogative, had no patience left for William Wellesley Pole. He libelled, he threatened, he schemed, and then, at the height of his madness, when every legal avenue had been exhausted and every scheme had been thwarted, he turned on the one man who should have been untouchable. He threatened to murder the Duke of Wellington, his own uncle, the hero of Waterloo, the man who had defeated Napoleon, who had reshaped the map of Europe, who was at that time the Prime Minister of England. William Wellesley Pole, the man who had never fought anything more dangerous than a tradesman's bill, threatened to kill the most famous soldier in the world. Wellington's response was characteristic. The Iron Duke, who had stood unmoved under artillery fire at Waterloo, who had watched men die around him without flinching, who had built a career on the principle that threats were only useful if you were prepared to carry them out, looked at his nephew's bluster and was not impressed. "The man is mad," Wellington reportedly said, not with anger, with diagnosis, the flat clinical assessment of a man who had spent his life distinguishing between genuine threats and noise. William was noise. He had always been noise. Loud, expensive, destructive noise, but noise nonetheless. Wellington held firm. The courts held firm. Dorothy and Emma held firm. And the children, William, James and Victoria, and were kept safe. And what of wicked William Wellesley Pole, as society now openly called him? Because this is the part of the story where you are allowed to feel something that Catherine never lived to feel. Satisfaction. His second marriage to Helena Bligh in 1828 was as disastrous as his first, though this time the disaster was mutual. Two predators in a cage, each consuming the other. There was no fortune to burn through this time, no Palladian mansion to demolish, no ancestral portraits to sell, just two people locked in a marriage that neither of them deserved, and both of them had earned. He continued to scheme for access to the Tylney-Long fortune that the courts had placed beyond his reach. He filed lawsuits, he petitioned, he wrote letters that alternated between self-pity and threats. The courts rebuffed him every time. The wall that Catherine had begun building on her deathbed held firm, buttressed by Wellington's influence, maintained by Dorothy and Emma's vigilance. but he could still cause damage in smaller, meaner ways. And he did. He stole furniture from Draycott House, Catherine's family estate in Wiltshire, the place where she was buried, the land her family had held for generations. He took pieces from the house that sheltered her grave and sold them to cover his gambling debts. Think about that. Think about the kind of man who would enter a house where his dead wife's body lay in the churchyard, where the woman he had destroyed was buried beneath the earth, where the name Tylney-Long was carved into stone that had stood for centuries, and take her things, again, still. Even in death, he was taking from her. Even when she had nothing left to give, he found something to steal. He removed paintings from walls that had held them for generations. He took silver from cabinets that Catherine's mother had filled. He stripped the house the way he had stripped everything else, methodically, without remorse, with the particular efficiency of a man who has had a great deal of practice in converting other people's possessions into gambling money. His own son, young William, who had been just 12 when his mother died and who had grown up hearing stories of the father he was not allowed to see, took him to court for it. The son Catherine had fought to protect was now protecting her legacy. The symmetry of it is almost too perfect to be real, but it is real. That is the thing about Catherine Tylney-Long's story. It requires no embellishment. The facts are devastating enough. William fled to Brussels to avoid his creditors, again always fleeing, always running from the consequences of his own actions, as though the English Channel were a moat that could protect him from accountability. Brussels was the preferred destination of the English debtor class, close enough to England to maintain the illusion of a temporary exile, far enough to escape the bailiffs. The city was full of men like William, men with titles and empty pockets, men who drank in cafes and spoke of the fortunes they had once possessed and would certainly possess again, any day now, as soon as this or that legal matter was resolved. William drank. He schemed. He wrote letters to anyone who might listen. Letters filled with self-pity and blame and the absolute refusal to accept that his circumstances were the direct and inevitable consequence of his own actions. He blamed his servants for the financial ruin. He blamed his wife's family for the custody ruling. He blamed the courts, the lawyers, his uncle Wellington, the government, and God, everyone and everything except the man who stared back at him from the mirror every morning. He inherited his father's title as 4th Earl of Mornington in 1845, which might have provided some dignity in his declining years, but by then there was no dignity left to reclaim. The title was an empty vessel, a name without substance, a rank without resources, a position in society occupied by a man whom society wanted only to forget. In his final years he survived on a small pension, £10 a week, allowed by his cousin, the 2nd Duke of Wellington. £10. The man who had married the richest woman in England, who had burned, threw £40,000 a year as though it were kindling, who had thrown parties that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime, was kept alive by the charity of the family he had disgraced. £10 a week. It would have been pitiable if he had not earned every moment of his poverty. He died on the 1st of July, 1857, in lodgings in Thayer Street, Manchester Square. Not in a Palladian mansion, not in a country estate, not surrounded by servants or family or anyone who might have mourned him with sincerity. In rented rooms, alone with whatever remained of his memories, which must have included, somewhere in the wreckage of his mind, the image of a dark-eyed girl of 21 in a white wedding dress and a necklace worth 25,000 guineas, stepping into a yellow carriage on the happiest day of her life. Heart disease took him, though one might argue that whatever organ he possessed in that capacity had failed long before his body caught up. His Obituary in the Morning Chronicle did not mourn him. It dissected him. It called him what he was, a spendthrift, a profligate, and a gambler in his youth who became debauched in his maturity. It was not a farewell. It was a verdict, and it was a verdict that Catherine Tylney-Long, who had endured 13 years of marriage to this man, who had been robbed and humiliated and infected and abandoned, and had still in her dying breaths found the strength to protect her children, would have been entirely justified in delivering herself had she lived long enough to speak it. But this is not where the story ends. Not truly, because Catherine won. She did not live to see it. She never sat in the Chancery Court and watched the judge strip William of his children. She never read the obituaries that called him a monster. She never knew that her name would be remembered and his would be despised. But the things she did in those final weeks, the will she changed on her deathbed, the chancery proceedings she initiated, the decision to place her children beyond their father's reach, those acts outlived her. They outlived William. They outlived the century itself. The case of Wellesley versus the Duke of Beaufort became a landmark in English family law. It established, for the first time, the principle that a father's rights over his children were not absolute, that the welfare of the child could outweigh the prerogatives of the parent. It was a crack in the wall of paternal supremacy that would widen over the following decades into genuine reform. And this is where the story becomes something larger than one woman's tragedy, because Catherine's case, the case that began with a dying woman changing her will in a modest house in Richmond, set in motion a chain of legal reforms that would fundamentally alter the relationship between English law and English women. In 1839, Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act, the first piece of legislation in English history to give mothers any legal right to their children. Under the old law, a mother had no claim whatsoever. A father could take his children at any time for any reason, and the mother had no legal recourse. The Custody of Infants Act, championed by the writer and activist Caroline Norton, herself a woman who had been separated from her children by an abusive husband, allowed mothers to petition for custody of children under 7. It was a modest reform, but it was a beginning. And it was built on the precedent that Catherine's case had established, that a parent's behaviour mattered. Caroline Norton, it should be said, was a remarkable woman in her own right, a society beauty, a published poet, and a tireless campaigner who turned her own suffering into a weapon against the laws that had enabled it. Her husband, George Norton, had beaten her, stolen her earnings, and, after she left him, sued the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, for criminal conversation with his wife. The suit failed, but George Norton kept the children. Caroline could not see them, she could not write to them, she could not hold them, and the law, the same law that had consumed Catherine Tylney-Long, said this was perfectly right and proper. Caroline Norton spent years lobbying Parliament, writing pamphlets, making the argument that no civilized society should allow a father to use his children as instruments of punishment against their mother. And when she made that argument, she was not speaking into a void. The case of Wellesley versus the Duke of Beaufort, Catherine's case, had established that the courts could intervene. That precedent existed, that a woman's suffering could, in exceptional circumstances, outweigh a father's rights. Caroline Norton took that crack in the wall and hammered it wider. In 1857, Parliament passed the Matrimonial Causes Act, which created the first civil divorce court in England and made divorce accessible without an Act of Parliament. Women could now, for the first time, escape marriages that were destroying them. Not easily, not equally, not without stigma, but legally. The Act drew heavily on the arguments that had been made in cases like Catherine's, that the sanctity of marriage could not be used as a shield for abuse. And then came the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. The reforms that finally, after centuries of coverture, allowed married women to own property in their own names, to earn money and keep it, to sign contracts and appear in court and exist in the eyes of the law as human beings rather than appendages of their husbands. Each of these statutes chipped away at the system that had devoured Catherine Tylney-Long, and each of them owed something, however distantly, however indirectly, to the case that a dying woman had set in motion. Catherine did not live to see any of these reforms. She did not know that her suffering would become a legal precedent. She did not draft legislation or lobby Parliament or write pamphlets arguing for women's rights. She simply fought for her children. She simply refused to let the man who had destroyed her also destroy them. And in doing so, she cracked the foundation of a legal system that had treated women as property for as long as anyone could remember. Her eldest son, William, inherited what remained of the Tylney-Long estates, protected from his father by the court that Catherine had invoked and the uncle who had held the line. He became the 5th Earl of Mornington. He lived a quieter life than his father, which is perhaps the kindest thing that can be said about him, and perhaps the greatest gift his mother gave him. He married, he managed the estates that remained, and he never forgot what had been done to the woman who had given him both his fortune and his life. Wanstead House is gone. Nothing remains but a crater on an East London golf course where the foundations once stood. But in Wanstead Park, the grounds that George London designed and Humphrey Repton refined, people still walk where Catherine walked. And they say, the locals say, in that way that locals always say such things, that her ghost still wanders there, a woman in white walking the grounds of a house that no longer exists, mourning what was taken from her. I do not know if I believe in ghosts, but I believe in memory, and Catherine Tylney-Long deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote in a cautionary tale about foolish heiresses, not as the woman who should have known better, not as a victim whose downfall was her own fault for choosing the wrong man. She deserves to be remembered as what she was, a woman of extraordinary generosity, remarkable courage and quiet, devastating strength, who fought for her children with the last breath in her body and won a battle that changed the law of England. They called her the Wiltshire Heiress. But she was so much more than her fortune. She was a mother who, when everything else had been stripped from her, her money, her home, her health, her dignity, her very legal existence, found the one thing they could not take. Her will. Not the document, though that mattered too. Her will, her determination, her refusal to let the man who had destroyed her also destroy her children. And in the end, that was worth more than 40,000 a year. It was worth more than Wanstead House. It was worth more than every penny and every acre and every jewel that William Wellesley Pole ever squandered, because the money is gone. The house is gone, the jewels are scattered, but Catherine's children survived, and the law she helped change still stands. That is her revenge, quiet, permanent, and more devastating than anything her husband ever accomplished in his entire wretched life. I poured a lot of myself into this story, and I hope you felt that. This one is different from what I usually share with you. There is no obsessive duke who comes to save her, no grand romantic gesture, no happily ever after wrapped in silk and candlelight. And I thought about that before I brought this story to you. I wondered if it belonged here, on Aristocratic Hearts, where we come for escape, for passion, for the thrill of watching powerful men fall to their knees. But I think it does. I think Catherine's story belongs here precisely because it is true, because every fictional duke I have ever written, every man who knelt and whispered and fought and bled for the woman he loved, exists in contrast to men like William Wellesley Pole. We tell stories of obsessive devotion because the real world has always been full of men who took everything and gave nothing. We dream of being chosen because so many women were used. Catherine Tylney-Long was used, but she was not defeated. And if that is not a story worth telling, then I do not know what is. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening to something harder than what I usually ask of you. If this story moved you, if Catherine's courage and Catherine's heartbreak stayed with you, then leave a comment. Tell me what you felt. Tell me if you think she made the right choices, or if the world simply gave her no good choices to make. Tell me about the women in your own life who fought battles that no one saw. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. Because stories like this one deserve to be heard. They deserve an audience. And Catherine Tylney-Long deserves to be remembered by as many people as possible, 200 years after the world forgot her. I'll see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves. And remember, sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is simply refusing to be erased. Good night.